Let's have a chat. All right, so this is part 2 of 3 lectures today. I'll remind you of this whenever you start the third lecture, but the third lecture you will need to have read. This lecture and the one before this lecture, you didn't really have to read for. The third lecture, you will have to read. So if you haven't read yet, but just wanted to dip your toe into the class, I would say watch this video, go read, and then come back to the third video a little bit later, even tomorrow if you want, take your time. Okay, so social factors that relate to mental health and mental illness. So I'm really driving home what sociology of mental illness is here. So sociological studies reveal that several general aspects of social life are related to mental health. These are social integration, inequality, and meaningful collective belief systems. So being positively integrated in your social environment, low levels of inequality, and being a part of groups that have a collective belief system. These impact mental health in a positive way. Not only that, but when you were born and where you were born are also associated with mental health. Not just in terms of, well, I was born in the hood, so my mental health sucks, but also, being born in America, you're going to have a different experience, with mental health facilities, with insurance companies, and if you were living in a different country. So it's not just, your zip code, but also where you were at in the world at any given time. So suicide, and I'm not going to make you guys read Suicide. I mean, it's a really good book. If you've read it, then it's a good book. I'm not going to make you read it. But Suicide, written by Emil Durkheim, who you guys all should know because you've all had Intro to Social as a prereq. Durkheim's Suicide is the first explicitly sociological study of mental health. I'm not going to make you read it. I'm going to sum it up for you. The central theme is that people who are connected with their environment and who are connected with social institutions are less likely to commit suicide. So strong social ties decrease your likelihood of committing suicide. The stronger your ties are. Oh, sorry. I see that this is actually kind of off at the end here. Sorry, you saw my little note. Obviously it's it doesn't matter. If you didn't see it, you didn't see it. And if you did, then you know that it was not for this specific class. Okay. So people with strong ties are less likely to commit suicide. So people who are married with children were less likely to commit suicide than people who are married without children, who are less likely to commit suicide than somebody who is unmarried. Now, with that being said, there are nuances here. A person who is unmarried by choice, without children by choice, living their best life, is probably doing better than somebody who is in an abusive marriage and has kids they didn't want to have. So it's not that this is a definite, but when grouped, if we look at all people who are married with kids, all people who are married without kids, and all people who are unmarried without kids, if we just look at those 3 groups, we tend to find that married people with children have better mental health and are less likely to commit suicide. Actually, more importantly, it's about the suicide piece. Why is that? Because of those strong social ties. For better or for worse, people who are married and have children feel socially obligated, socially responsible to continue living because of these social ties. There's also an aspect of social support. You have more people in your life to notice when things are not going well for you, to notice when you're feeling a bit off, but overall, having these strong social ties, such as being in a marriage, having children, make you less likely to commit suicide. Members of religious groups that they're stricter tend to commit suicide less. Now, again, I'm not saying they have better mental health, but Catholics who share common practices, are a bit more strict, tend to commit suicide less than Protestants, which, whose religion encourages more free inquiry. Few people commit suicide during times of war and revolution. This is interesting because you might think it'd be the opposite. Oh, there's wars and there's revolutions and the world is on fire. People are going to not to want to live anymore. You would think so, right? But what Durkheim found is that during times of war, There's that collective sense of identity, that social tie to your environment. And so whenever there was a perceived threat to the country, people were less likely to commit acts of suicide. So overall, the takeaway is that whenever you have social ties, whether it's ties to your religion, ties to your country, or ties to your spouse, you're less likely to commit suicide than somebody who doesn't have those ties. Social integration, again, huge. The more meaningful social contacts you have, the better your mental health. Not just the more contacts you have, because you can have a ton of contact and it's all terrible, and that's going to be bad for your mental health. But meaningful social contact, that is the good stuff. Not only I mentioned this about marriage, people who are married are less likely to commit suicide, but it's also the regulative function. By being in a marriage, you are conforming to social norms. And part of that social norm is supporting your partner and being there for your partner. So it's social ties, but there's also kind of there's a norm aspect to it as well, in terms of you owe your partner to stick around and things like that. Increased involvement in voluntary organizations relates to better mental health. And so if you are choosing to go out and be a part of the Rutgers, vegetarian club, or if you are involved in the, the Jewish Center for Religious Life, meaningful involvement in voluntary organizations increases mental health, because that's you seeking out these relationships, and that's also part of having social ties. Now, there is a flip side to that, which we'll get into later in the semester, where it's kind of a catch-22, because if you're already not feeling great, you're going to be less likely to seek out these social ties. But generally speaking, having involvement in different groups, having meaningful social contact will make your mental health better if we look at patterns across groups. So of all the people who are involved in organizations voluntarily compared to all the people who are not involved in organizations voluntarily, we would see that if those two groups were compared, those who are involved voluntarily in groups would have better mental health overall if we just compared those two categories. Losing social attachment is going to be difficult for your mental health. That makes sense, right? Your partner leaves you, a parent passes away, an animal passes away. That can increase your levels of distress, right? It makes sense. And a lot of the things I'll tell you guys, there will be some things where you're like, whoa, what? A lot of the things I'll tell you guys, you're gonna already know it. It'll just be looking at it through a different lens. And so, of course, it makes sense that if a parent who you're close with passes away, you're going to be sad. But you're going to learn more about the role of social ties and perceived support and structural support in these things that you already kind of know. So think of a lot of this as building on your own experiences, is giving perspective to things you already kind of know. Socially integrated people are better able to cope with stressful situations. You have more support. You have more people who are aware of your existence. If you don't show up to a club meeting for 3 weeks straight, well, there are 20 people who know we got to reach out to that person and make sure they're okay. Residents of communities that have more social integration have better mental health. So neighborhoods that are clean, safe, the kind of neighborhoods where you go knock on your next door neighbor's door and ask them for some sugar. You go to the park and you walk your dog and you say, hey, neighbor that I know by a first name. Those kind of neighborhoods foster good mental health. If you live in an area where there's little cohesion, you don't trust your neighbors, you only go outside to get in your car to go to your job, that promotes psychological distress, because there's low social integration. The more socially integrated you are into your neighborhood and your community, the better mental health you'll have. And so overall, social integration is positively associated with mental health. We get satisfaction from our intimate relationships, and we suffer when we don't have them, when we lose them. Inequality makes mental health worse. Okay. I'm going to explain, but that probably, makes some sense in its own. Again, you probably know that. If I said true or false, inequality makes you happy, you guys would probably say false. You know that there's a relationship there, but I'm going to explain in a bit, and we'll talk about this a lot throughout the semester in detail. So inequalities, especially class inequalities, have huge impacts on mental health. poverty is especially associated with mental health, but negative impacts of impoverished circumstance on mental health has a greater impact than the positive impact of economic abundance on mental health. And so if you have $0 in your bank account, and then you get $10,000 overdrafted, so you're negative $10,000 in your account, the impact that that has on your mental health will be greater than if you gained $10,000. So I know it might be a bit confusing. The point is that being impoverished has a greater impact on your mental health than having money does. And I'm curious why you guys think that is. You don't have, not like a right answer, but I'm curious, why do you think that might be? Also keep in mind, it's not just how much money or resources you have, but relative wealth. And so if you know like Scottie Pippen, and you guys probably don't know Scottie Pippen, right? Probably not. Okay, yeah, well, he's a good example. Either Scottie Pippen was a really good basketball player, but he wasn't paid as much as he should have been, and he was pretty pissed about it, and quite bitter over time. But Scottie Pippen was rich. He could have anything he wanted. And so the point that I make there is that, you know, even an NBA player, an NFL player, a movie star, a celebrity, if they have less money relative to the people around them, even though they are richer than almost everybody, they can still have low perceived mental health. And so it's like, even if you live in an upper class neighborhood, if you're the poorest person on the block, it doesn't matter that you're rich, because mentally you don't have as much as other people in your neighborhood. So keep in mind, it's not just, you know, rich people versus poor people with mental health. It's relative. So even if you do have a lot of money, if you're the poorest one in your private school, that can still impact your mental health. Work conditions. Jobs that are autonomous, meaning you have kind of free will and control, creative, where you get to flex your creative muscle, and really just jobs that give you control over your actions and are self-directed, are better for mental health. Jobs that have someone helicoptering over you, that don't let you exercise free will, that don't let you exercise your creativity, tend to have more of a negative impact on mental health. Out of all of the economic groups in the country, unemployed people have the poorest mental health. Now, keep in mind, I didn't say working class, lower class, or poor. I said unemployed. Why do you guys think that unemployed people specifically have the worst mental health in America? Egalitarian marriages. The more equal your relationship is, the better mental health you tend to have. When it's not egalitarian, the dominant spouse tends to have better mental health than the spouse who has less power. Overall, the lower the level of inequality is, the better mental health is. It makes sense, right? This was really an overview. Whenever we talk about gender, sexuality, race, class, intersectionality, the criminal justice system, we're going to really dive into this and pick it apart, and it's going to be super fun. But for now, I just wanted to give you an overview. Cultural values. Groups that provide their members with clear and attainable values tend to promote better mental health. Groups that have expectations that are unrealistic are hell for mental health. And so if we think about the American dream is very meritocratic, meaning that you are taught that if you just work hard, you can pull yourself ahead. Well, it's not true. It's just not. There are people who don't work at all and are billionaires because their parents were billionaires. And there are people who have worked 80-hour weeks for 30 years and are living in the projects. That's just the reality. That's just the reality of our lives. However, we live in a society that tells us if you just work hard, then you can have this dream, but it's not true. And so what happens then is people who fail to achieve the American dream blame themselves, because they've been taught their whole lives, you're in control of your future. And so if you're indoctrinated to believe you're in control of your future and then you fail, well, then you're blaming yourself. And so that's one reason why, despite the fact that America does tend to encourage seeking help for mental health, we do see relatively poor mental health in America, partially because the American dream is portrayed as meritocratic, but in actuality is not. And so because people cannot attain the values of their cultures or cannot meet the value of American culture, that can lead to low mental health. So failure to achieve the American dream is absolutely a predictor of poor mental health. Religious people report less distress than those who are not religious. Again, with the caveat that if you are religious, but you feel persecuted by your religion or not accepted by your religion, you're going to have rough mental health. But generally speaking, if we just say religious versus non-religious, religious people tend to have better mental health, again, because their group provides clear and attainable goals for them sometimes. Those in collectivist cultures have better mental health than those in individualistic cultures. Caveat, we have to think here about self-reporting. So is it that collectivist cultures are just better? Or maybe it's that people in collectivist cultures are less likely to report having psychological distress. All of this is food for thought right now. This is an intro class. This is the first day. This is all food for thought. And so cultural values that provide group cohesion, meaning, and purpose to life are conducive to mental health. Cohort membership. When you were born matters. A birth cohort is a group of people born in a certain time and place. So baby boomers, millennials, Gen Z, those are all birth cohorts. Birth cohorts, yes, there's diversity within a cohort, but both birth cohorts share historical and social experiences that differ from others. So everybody who went through 9/11, everybody who lived through the Obama and Trump presidencies, everybody who survived the Great Depression, all of these are historical events that impacted your lives. Living through the time when there was the first Black or biracial president is going to be different than living in a time when there had never been a person of color in the presidency. Living past the point where there was a terrorist attack on the country is going to be different than if you never lived through that. And so it's not that everybody in a birth cohort is the same, but because these major events happen, we can draw patterns within birth cohorts. Trends in marriage rates. So like I said, married people are more likely to have better mental health than people who are unmarried. However, we're in a current time when people are getting married way less than ever before. So maybe that'll change. Maybe because the norm is becoming to not get married so young, to not have so many kids, maybe we'll see the reverse. Maybe we'll start seeing that unmarried people have better mental health. I don't know. The point is that these trends in marriage, in fashion, in history, impact the mental health that you're going to have in your birth cohort. Changes in fashion. If you were part of the birth cohort where skinny was the ideal beauty type versus being in a birth cohort where being kind of like a Coke bottle hourglass shape, that's going to impact you. Because if you are a fat person, and I say that like openly because fat's not a bad word. If you are a fat person and you were born in a time when everybody values skinniness versus if you were born in a time when everybody values being voluptuous, that's going to have a different impact on your mental health. Technology, being born in a time when all interaction was face-to-face versus being born in a time when calling someone on the phone is weird, let alone seeing in person. And so birth cohorts, it's not that you can say all baby boomers have this disease or all millennials have this experience. The point, though, is that by being in a birth cohort, you and people in your cohort are going to experience similar historical events, similar trends in fashion, body image ideals, similar trends in worldviews, relationship norms. So if you are a queer person now, you're going to have a different relationship with your identity than if you were a queer person in the 1800s, for example. So what I mean, the takeaway is that if you are members of different generations, have different psychological experiences. So younger generations are more likely to be treated for ADHD, eating disorders, autism, and bipolar conditions. Now, I'm not saying that younger people are more likely to experience these symptoms. I'm saying they're more likely to be treated for these symptoms, which could be about the framing of the disorder. It could also be about the willingness to seek treatment. So we know, well, maybe you guys don't know, but you'll know soon. You'll know now. Younger people are more likely to seek help for mental health disturbances. And so maybe it's not that, millennials are just, more mentally ill. It could be that. It could also be that millennials are more comfortable seeking treatment. So we'll think about things like that, not just which group has this disorder more, but which group is also encouraged to be honest about these symptoms, which group is encouraged to report these symptoms. And so the point, though, is that anybody's chances of being diagnosed with any disorder is going to be related not just to their own brain chemistry or their own experiences, but also when they happen to be born. Cross-cultural differences. So 3% of women in rural Spain report having depression versus about a third of women in urban Zimbabwe. Less than 2% of Puerto Ricans have social phobias, or people in Puerto Rico have social phobias, versus 16% in Switzerland. Less than 1% of those in Shanghai are diagnosed with alcoholism versus almost a quarter of Native Americans. About a fifth of Americans have anxiety disorders versus only 2% in China. So is it that, I took a plane and now I'm in Shanghai, whoop, I'm not an alcoholic anymore. That's not it. That's not how it works. It's that living in these different areas, you have a different culture. There are different norms, different barriers to getting help, different barriers to thinking you need help, different levels of inequality, different types of social integration. And so there's variation in social stressors, integration, inequality, systems of meaning, distress, measures of mental illness. And so it's not just that, it's never just about your own brain chemistry or, what's wrong with me. All of our experiences with mental health are shaped by when we were born, what was happening when we were born, and where we were born at. So what has the response been to mental disorders? It's changed. It's changed now. It's changed a lot. So the public image of mentally ill people used to be quote unquote crazy, talking to yourself, screaming uncontrollably. And now it's much different. Mental illness now is kind of more baked into the possibilities of experience than it was before. Historically, people with mental illness were seen as crazy, mad, bizarre, and this carried a lot of stigma. Part of this is that previously, only the most disruptive and severely distressed people would seek help. Because only the most severely distressed people were seeking help, the only people that the public were seeing that was in these asylums were people who were, the farthest end of the spectrum of disturbed. Whereas now we have an understanding that there are people who have more severe distress, but also there are moderate amounts of mental illness, mild amounts of mental illness. And so we see more variety today, whereas in the past, if I said mental illness, your mind would go to a person screaming in a straitjacket in an asylum. That's not the image we have so much anymore, at least not with all disorders. Medicalization is the primary change that we have seen in recent times. So in the past, mental illnesses were seen as spiritual troubles, moral troubles, behavioral issues that you could fix with, repenting or just dealing with it or praying the sick away. We don't see that now. If you go to a doctor and tell that doctor that you want to commit suicide, and that doctor tells you, just go pray about it, you could probably sue that doctor, right? Like if you told someone that story, they would probably be like, wow, you can sue that doctor, especially if you actually ended up, doing the act. Versus in the past, that'd be totally normal. You go to a doctor, they say, oh, just pray a little bit. Go to confession, and that would be totally normal. Now, if you have a mental disorder or mental distress, it's seen as a disease to be corrected. So any mental issue generally speaking, there are caveats to this, but this is again, an intro class, we're drawing patterns here. Generally speaking, if you go to a doctor and you tell them you're having symptoms of, depression, anxiety, they'll write you a prescription before you even have a therapist or a psychiatrist, and they won't even mention a priest. If you mention, oh, well, no, I don't need that medication, I'll just go pray about it, the doctor might look at you like something is wrong with you. Because in the past, prayer and counseling was more fitting, but now it's all medical. Just take this pill, just take that pill, just up your dose. And yeah, therapy is, great, but you need medication. That's how society handles mental illness now, is through medicalization. That is a significant difference than the past. Now, there are pros and cons to this. People are more willing to seek help, but what do you guys think? What do you guys think some cons are? What's another pro of medicalization? And then what do you think could go wrong by this? And if you can't think of anything, that's okay, but try. Changing categories, and then we'll talk about this one later in the semester too. This one's fun. Categories themselves have undergone changes. PTSD used to be something that only veterans could experience. It was only, severe, violent trauma. Now, like, I had a car accident and my therapist was like, yeah, you're having PTSD. I mean, sure, I'm not disagreeing. The point though is that the threshold for what counts as PTSD, the threshold for what counts as depression, for what counts as a mood disorder has drastically shifted. And so my PTSD, if I go to a doctor and say I have PTSD, versus if I, 150 years ago said I had PTSD, it'd be a totally different response. Childhood behaviors are increasingly being labeled as mental disorders. So not only do we see medicalization increasing in adults, but also with children as well. Kids have always been annoying. Sorry. It's true. Kids are annoying. They've always annoyed their parents and their teachers, but it's only recently in the past few decades that children being annoying has become a mental disorder. We see this especially with race and gender. And we'll talk about this, I think in 2 weeks. Black children, Black boys specifically, especially, are more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness than white children. And so we'll see something like, and I'll show you, you might be like, oh, I don't believe that. Don't worry, I have receipts. I'll have you read stuff about this. But I'll give you a little spoiler. There have been studies that show if there's a same age, a white boy and a young Black boy doing the same exact behavior, screaming, not listening, being disruptive, the Black child is exponentially more likely to be diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. Oppositional defiant disorder is basically a disorder that says you're so disruptive and so bad that it's a mental illness. What we see is that white children are more likely to say, oh, well, he's just cranky today. He's just rambunctious. He's just excited. Whereas Black kids are told they're bad, they're disruptive, they're a problem. And so not only do we see an increase in medicalization for children overall, we also see especially that there's something going on there with race and gender, which, given what I mentioned vaguely about inequality, should make a little bit of sense. And excuse me, and this goes for other things as well. And there are differences by medication, by disorder, but generally speaking, there is a pattern of children being diagnosed more and more, way more than in previous decades. The most common diagnosis in America is major depression. 17% of people in their lifetime suffer from major depressive disorder. In the past, depression was just seen as like, oh, something bad happened. When that bad thing stops happening, you'll be fine. Oh, you lost your job. When you get a job, you'll be fine. Oh, you feeling sad? Just go lay down and drink some ginger ale. If you get that, if you know where that's from, then kudos to you if you get that joke. If not, it's silly. Don't worry about it. Sorry. So in the past, major depression would be seen as, response to a loss or a hardship, versus now it's like, oh, you feeling kind of sad today? Do you want some Zoloft? You want some Prozac? Again, I'm not saying that meds are bad. I'm saying it's worth talking about, because you can have the exact same feelings that you're having right now 30 years ago, 70 years ago, 120 years ago, and you'll have a totally different diagnosis, totally different treatment, totally different social response. And so depression is so common. If I asked you to name 5, I'm not going to. If I asked you to name 5 people you've met in your life that have depression, you could do it flat out. If I asked you that 70, 80 years ago, you'd be like, depression? I don't know no one who's depressed. It's totally different. These categories change. Social phobias. When first introduced in the DSM, social phobias impacted no more than 1 to 2% of the population. 20 years later, social phobias are the top 2 common mental disorders, only topped by depression. Again, these categories change. When you're born, where you're born is going to drastically impact how your mental health is perceived and whether it's diagnosed as anything at all. Maybe 70 years ago, you'd be totally normal, but today you're ill, or vice versa. Same thing with homosexuality. Decades and decades ago, you were mentally ill. Now, you're not. People might not understand homosexuality fully even today, but the chances of someone telling you that you're mentally ill is much less than whenever it was in the DSM decades ago. People are way more willing to seek treatment now. That makes sense. I've been hinting at that, not hinting, just flat out saying it. People seek treatment more now. The percent of people in therapy for depression increased by 76% in just 20 years. That's what I'm saying. It's not that mental health treatment is objective. It just is or it isn't. You have it or you don't. It's completely based on society, on norms, on culture. Now, there are characteristics that impact whether you're more likely to seek help or not. Women are more likely to seek help for depression and mental health than men. Younger and middle-aged people are more likely to seek help than elderly. White people are more likely to seek help for mental health than racial minorities. And educated people are more likely to seek help for mental health than less educated. Of course, there are variations. There are white people who will never get help, and there are racial minorities who are excited to get help. But if you split the population into, and I'm sorry to say women versus men. I know that there are other genders. I'm just making a crude contrast right now for purposes of this overview. We will talk about NBs and different identities later on. I am not endorsing a gender binary, but just to make these kind of comparisons, that's why I say women versus men. But am I saying that all women seek help and no men don't? No. But I'm saying if you take all women and all men and compare those groups, women would have more of a chance of seeking help than men. Medication is huge. Like I mentioned, the dosages aren't necessarily getting higher, but the likelihood, that's what it is. The dosages themselves aren't getting higher necessarily, but the likelihood of prescribing medication, regardless of dose, has been on the rise. And so the use of medication tripled in just 12 years. There is a 250% increase in teenagers getting meds and drugs in 7 years. A 7-year span, a 250% increase. In 7 years, between 1995 and 2002, there was a 6-fold increase in teens receiving the strongest antipsychotics. And so the thing is, as reliance on drugs increase, psychotherapy decreases. Worth talking about. Again, please don't tell people, oh, my professor hates medication. I promise you, I don't. But I think it's interesting that we're replacing therapy with medication. I think it's worth talking about. And I think as we go through the class, you guys will think so too, especially once you read those chapters in your textbook. I think you'll also start to feel like there's a conversation to be had here. Because it'd be one thing if therapy was, increasing and drugs were as well. Okay, well, we have two treatments together, but we're seeing less therapy and more drugs. Again, medicalization is the trend. We'll say one of, to be, conservative with such claims, one of the most significant trends of our time. So in conclusion, sociological research shows how well-being and distress are shaped by social circumstance and social organizations. Social integration, so how connected you are to your environment, stratification and inequality, and being a part of a group with a collective meaning system or belief system, all impact emotional well-being. Social processes influence whether we think we have disorders, how we treat them, and what kind of resources we perceive ourselves to have. That's part of it too. I'm talking about therapy and medication. There are other types of treatments for mental health. The fact that my mind immediately goes to therapy and meds, I'm a product of my environment. That's what comes to mind. If you ask somebody, in rural South Asia, for example, they might not immediately think about therapy and drugs. They might have a totally different response. Ideas of what it means to be healthy or what it means to be mentally disturbed have also radically changed. And so a number of social groups, farm companies, mental health practitioners, the media, the government are encouraging people to medicalize their emotional suffering, for better and or for worse, I would argue. Okay, you have one more lecture after this. Read your readings before you watch that lecture, okay? Okay, see you soon.